The morning after my honeymoon, my mother-in-law slapped me across the face in front of her entire family for the crime of answering back. Except I hadn't said a word. Not one. I'd been sitting at that breakfast table with my hands wrapped around a coffee mug, listening to her tell a story that wasn't even true, and before I could open my mouth to correct her, her palm had already found my cheek. Then she straightened her blouse, looked around the table at her sister, her nephew, two staff members who'd worked at that inn for 20 years, and said, calm as anything, "This is how we train wives here." Nobody gasped. Nobody stood up. My new husband looked down at his plate like the tablecloth had suddenly become the most interesting thing in Vermont. I want you to hold on to that image, because 6 weeks later, that same woman would be sitting across a conference table from me, watching everything she'd built and hidden fall apart in under an hour. My name is Lena, and I used to think silence was weakness. I was wrong. Sometimes silence is just patience wearing a disguise. I need to back up, because you have to understand who I was before that morning to understand what I became after it. I met Grant Whitfield at a fundraising gala 2 years before our wedding, the kind of event I attended for work, not for fun. I was a contracts reviewer for a regional bank at the time, the person nobody invites to parties but everybody eventually needs, because I could read 50 pages of legal language and find the one sentence that didn't belong. Grant found me hiding near the dessert table, and instead of the usual small talk, he asked me what I actually did for a living and then listened to the answer like it fascinated him. That was Grant. Quiet, attentive, the kind of man who remembered which coffee order was yours after hearing it once. I fell for him the way you fall for someone reliable, slowly, and then all at once, the way trust builds when nobody's rushing it. His family owned the Whitfield Inn, a beautiful old property in a small Vermont town, built by his grandfather, expanded by his father, and now run, in practice if not entirely on paper, by his mother, Diane. Grant told me early on that his mother was particular. I found out later that particular was the polite word for a woman who had spent 3 decades making sure every decision in that family, big or small, ran through her first. I met Diane for the first time at a Sunday dinner 4 months into dating Grant. She hugged me like I was already family, told me my dress was lovely, asked thoughtful questions about my career. I remember driving home that night thinking I'd gotten lucky. It took almost a year for me to notice the pattern underneath the warmth. Every compliment came with a small correction folded inside it. I brushed it off as old-fashioned. I told myself a lot of generous things in those early years, the way you do when you want very badly for something to be simple. Grant proposed on a hiking trail in early spring, and I said yes before he'd even finished the sentence. The wedding planning that followed was the first real test, though I didn't recognize it as one at the time. Diane inserted herself into every decision, the venue, the guest list, even the seating chart, which she reorganized twice without telling me. When Grant and I quietly moved 2 tables ourselves, just to seat his cousin away from an old family feud nobody wanted repeated at the reception, I thought nothing of it. It was a small, sensible decision. We'd made it together. The wedding day itself was genuinely beautiful. Diane cried during the vows and called me her new daughter in front of 200 guests, and for one evening, I let myself believe every worry I'd had was simply nerves. Grant and I left for our honeymoon 3 days later, 10 days on the coast, phones mostly off, nothing between us but sunlight and each other. I came home rested, tanned, and completely unprepared for what was waiting at that breakfast table. We'd agreed, before we even left, that our first morning back would be spent having breakfast at the inn, a small tradition, Grant said, a way of easing back into normal life. Diane was pouring coffee and telling his aunt a story about the reception, and at some point the story bent, without warning, into a complaint about the seating chart, the one decision Grant and I had actually made together. She said it had embarrassed the family in front of important guests. I opened my mouth, gently, to explain that Grant had approved it too, and I hadn't even finished the sentence when her hand crossed my face. The sound of it is still the loudest thing I remember from that morning. Grant's cousin dropped her fork. The staff member refilling water glasses froze mid-pour. And I sat there, cheek burning, waiting, genuinely waiting, for my husband to say something. He said quietly, to no one in particular, "Mom didn't mean it like that." That sentence hurt more than the slap did. Because the slap was Diane showing me who she was. That sentence was Grant showing me who he might become, if I let him. I didn't cry at that table. I finished my coffee, excused myself, and went upstairs to the room we were staying in while our new house finished renovations. I sat on the edge of the bed and made myself a single quiet promise. I was never going to raise my voice in that house again. Not out of fear. Out of strategy. I had decided in that exact minute that I would never again fight this woman on ground she controlled. For the 2 weeks that followed, I played my part with a discipline I didn't know I had. I smiled at family dinners. Diane began asking me to help organize vendor files and event paperwork in the inn's back office. Unpaid, of course, but apparently that was also something Whitfield wives did now. Because she was the one who kept sending me in there, my presence in that office never attracted a second glance from anyone. I never once mentioned the slap. Neither did Grant, though I started noticing something new in him, a stiffness at the dinner table whenever his mother corrected me, a beat of hesitation before he agreed with her, like the words were catching somewhere in his throat before he let them out anyway. Diane, reading my silence as surrender, grew bolder by the week. She corrected the way I set a table. She told a guest, within my hearing, that I was still learning the family way. Once, when I gently disagreed with her about a linen vendor's pricing, she reminded me, in front of Grant, to watch my tone unless I wanted another lesson. This time, Grant didn't stay silent. "That's enough, Mom," he said, quiet but firm, and left the room without finishing his dinner. It wasn't much, but it was the first crack I'd seen. It was during one of those office afternoons that I first noticed a locked drawer, slightly open because someone had rushed out without closing it properly. I'd only been looking for a stapler. Inside, folders I didn't recognize, not booking records, but something labeled Whitfield Family Trust. I knew vaguely that Grant's grandfather had set up a scholarship trust years earlier, meant to help local kids from the town go into hospitality and trade programs, something he'd been proud of, something Grant mentioned occasionally with a kind of wistfulness, like it was a piece of the family legacy that had quietly stopped mattering to anyone but him. I closed the drawer that day and said nothing, but something in me, the old reviewer's instinct, the part of my brain trained for years to catch the one wrong number hiding in 100 right ones, refused to let it go. Over the following weeks, since Diane herself kept sending me back into that office to sort files, I had every reason to be there, and no one thought twice about it. Slowly, carefully, at night after everyone had gone home, I started reading. What I found took the breath clean out of me. The scholarship trust, which was supposed to receive an annual transfer from the inn's profits, hadn't been funded in almost 4 years. But the paperwork showed otherwise, showed transfers made, on time, every year, each one authorized by a trust resolution bearing 2 signatures. Diane's, and a second one meant to be Grant's. I photographed every page I could reach, hands shaking, telling myself there had to be an explanation. I needed to be certain before I said a word to anyone, especially Grant. I'd learned enough by then to know that in that house, my word alone would never be treated as sufficient evidence of anything. Then I understood what I was actually looking at, and it frightened me more than the missing money itself. The trust required 2 trustee signatures on any authorization releasing funds for a purpose other than scholarships, Diane's, and, since his father had passed, Grant's. Grant had never signed a single one of these resolutions. He'd never even been asked to. And yet his signature was there, on every one, for 4 straight years. I knew Grant's signature, the careful loop of his G, the low, fast cross of his T. This one was close. Someone had clearly practiced. It just wasn't his. I sat with that discovery for 3 full days before I did anything at all. I thought about the slap. I thought about this is how we train wives here. And I finally understood what all of it had actually been about. This had never been napkins, or seating charts, or tone of voice. Diane wasn't training a daughter-in-law. She was protecting a system, one where her son's signature could simply be manufactured whenever it was inconvenient to ask for the real one, and where a wife who noticed too much could be quietly dismissed as imagining things. I reached out to an old friend from my banking years, an estate attorney named Patricia Doyle, and met her at a coffee shop 2 towns over, somewhere no one from Diane's circle would recognize either of us. I laid the photographs on the table between us. Patricia went quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Lena, this isn't a family disagreement anymore. This is fraud, and forging a co-trustee's signature on a binding resolution is a serious matter on its own. You need to bring your husband into this immediately, and you need everything documented before anyone suspects you're looking." That night, after Diane had left the inn and the house had gone quiet, I sat Grant down at our kitchen table and showed him everything. I watched his expression change page by page, confusion first, then disbelief, then something that looked unmistakably like grief. He held one of the resolutions for a long time, running his thumb over a signature that wasn't his. "She's been signing my name," he finally said. "For years." Looking back, I realized this wasn't entirely new to him. He'd been noticing small things for weeks, an offhand comment from his aunt about a board decision he didn't remember making, a signature line on an old form that looked strange to him at a glance. He'd pushed the discomfort aside each time, the way you do with a mother you've spent your whole life trying not to doubt. Now he couldn't push it aside anymore. We didn't confront her right away. Patricia was firm about the order of things. Evidence first, confrontation second, always through proper channels. As co-trustee, Grant had every legal right to the trust's full banking history, so Patricia formally requested those records on his behalf, directly from the bank, rather than anyone quietly pulling papers from a drawer. The records confirmed everything the folders had shown. We also tracked down a former bookkeeper named Alice, who had left the inn abruptly 3 years earlier under circumstances nobody in the family had ever fully explained. Patricia found her, and Alice agreed to talk. She told us she'd once flagged the missing scholarship transfers directly to Diane, quietly, professionally, and had been let go within the month, told her services were simply no longer needed. Diane, through all of this, had no idea anything was happening beneath her feet. She continued correcting the way I folded napkins. She continued reminding Grant's aunt, at a family dinner, that I'd turned out to be a fast learner after all. I smiled and passed the potatoes. I had learned by then that the most powerful thing I could do was let her keep believing she had already won. The confrontation happened on a Tuesday afternoon, at a meeting Patricia arranged with the trust's outside auditor, framed simply as a routine annual review, the kind of meeting Diane had sat through a dozen times without a flicker of concern. She walked in expecting paperwork and small talk. Instead she found Grant, myself, Patricia, the auditor, and 4 years of falsified transfer resolutions laid out across the table. I wish I could tell you I felt triumphant. Mostly, I just felt tired, the specific tiredness that comes from finally setting down something heavy you've been carrying alone for months. Diane's face moved through several emotions before settling on anger, and she turned to Grant first, not me, telling him his father would be ashamed of him for believing this girl over his own mother. Grant didn't waver. "The signature isn't mine, Mom," he said. "You know it isn't. And that scholarship money never reached a single student in 4 years. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a choice you made over and over and kept making." The auditor reviewed the records in full and presented the findings directly to the trust board, Grant's aunt and 2 of his grandfather's oldest friends, the only people with the authority to act on them. After hearing the evidence, the board voted unanimously to remove Diane as trustee, effective immediately. The redirected funds, with interest, were ordered restored to the scholarship account under new, independent oversight. Patricia later helped file a formal report regarding the forged resolutions, and Diane was required to retain her own legal counsel for the long, difficult process that followed. In a town as small as ours, it was impossible to keep quiet. Guests who'd stayed at the inn for decades heard the whispers. Old friends stopped calling. The woman who had ruled every room she ever walked into found herself, for the first time in her life, having to explain herself to people who no longer automatically believed her. As for me, I never raised my voice through any of it, not once. I didn't need to. Grant apologized more than once for that breakfast table, for the weeks of silence that followed it, and I believed him, because I'd already watched the change happening in small pieces for weeks before the reveal, and then I watched him finish it, in a room full of people who mattered, when it actually counted. We stayed together, not because forgiveness came easily, but because the man who stood at that table and told his mother the truth was not the same man who had once looked down at his plate and said nothing. Diane still lives in town. I see her sometimes, at a distance, at the grocery store. She doesn't train anyone anymore. She isn't on any board. She isn't asked to sign anything more significant than a birthday card. I've come to believe that the loudest people in a room are usually loud because no one has ever made them account for anything. Sometimes all you have to do is wait, watch, and read the paperwork nobody thinks you're smart enough to understand. If someone ever tells you that silence means you've already lost, I hope you remember this story, and I hope you ask yourself one question. What would you do if the person hurting you had no idea you've been keeping score the entire time? If this story moved you, hit subscribe. Sophie Revenge brings you a brand new story just like this one every single day.